gentlemen, if you have not caught on by now, Russia is more than serious about what they're doing. They're moving quickly, and there's a lot going on. Here's the update. All right, folks, let's get into this. We've got a lot to talk about today. We are going to go over 4 very specific and, might I say, interesting articles that have come out, and all of which are very telling. They speak very vividly about things that are going on in Russia, and they are significant. Very, very significant. So let's get into some of these articles. Once I read through some of these articles, then I'm going to update you on what this all means. And we might even have a few moments. Actually, I'm being a little funny. We will have a few moments to talk about the biblical significance of all of this, because there is some real significance here. So let me get into these articles. The first one here is entitled, Russian Military Almost Completely Reconstituted, U.S. official says. Yeah, folks, that is no joke. And by the way, this article is dated April the 3rd, so it's a little while ago, but nonetheless, it is remarkably relevant. Let me read this to you. It says, Russia has rebuilt its military after suffering enormous losses during its invasion of Ukraine, according to U.S. State Department official. By the way, this is no small thing. I think that it's really important to note that if Russia has the ability to reconstitute its capacity to, or rebuild its capacity to function as an aggressive military force, even in the midst of a lot of losses, it should say something about how serious it is, how dedicated they are to doing what they're doing, and they are not an enemy that lacks formidability, okay? This news is shouldn't be surprising to a lot of people, especially when we consider what Ezekiel 38 says about Russia's future. But let me read the rest of this. It says, we have assessed over the course of the last couple of months that Russia has almost completely reconstituted militarily. This is the Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, that's saying this. And this was at an event that was hosted by the Center for a New American Security. Now, the article goes on to say, Campbell's assessment seems to contradict those of the Pentagon's and American allies in Europe. At a meeting of countries that support Ukraine last month, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that Russia had suffered more than 315,000 casualties during the war, with a drop in American aid leading to ammunition shortages on Ukraine's front lines. Russia forces have advanced, but those too have been costly, the Pentagon has said. The article goes on to say, in an interview earlier this year, the chair of Lithuania's National Security Committee estimated it would take Russia between 5 and 7 years to reconstitute its forces for a full-scale war. Again, it's just funny how that works, because how are they able to make those estimates? How are they even able to know the capacity of Russia to be able to constitute their military forces, especially understanding the fact that they have kept up with the production of all of their weapons and bullets and shells and all that stuff at a much more rapid pace than all of NATO put together, including the United States of America. So something smells when they say that's not the case. The article goes on to say, still, Moscow has surged defense spending since 2022, up 6% of national GDP in its 2024 budget. The rise is part of a larger effort by the Kremlin to move its economy, and in particular, its defense industry, onto a wartime footing. And by the way, they are very, very much doing that. They're very successful at doing that. Let me read this next paragraph. It says, part of its success comes from China's support, along with that from North Korea and Iran. Both Campbell and another senior administration official, speaking with reporters this week on the condition of anonymity, said that China has helped its partner endure economic and military setbacks in the last 2 years. He goes on to say this. Here's the quote. We've really seen the People's Republic of China start to help to rebuild Russia's defense industrial base, essentially backfilling the trade from European partners. Okay, let me just stop here, because I'm not even going to continue to read the rest of this article, because we've got other articles to read. But let me just make myself very, very clear here, okay? This ally that we keep talking about, or this axis of evil that people oftentimes refer to, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about China, Iran, when we talk about North Korea, listen, they're all alive and well, and they are all helping each other immensely. And the kind of help that China is bringing to the table for Russia isn't going to do China any favors, which is partially one of the reasons why I think it's going to become inconsequential in Bible prophecy. We really don't see much mention there in the Bible, but that's a whole different subject for a whole different day. Let me get on to the next article because I'm going to build this and then we're going to go back and talk about why all of this is important, okay? Now, this article you'll find in Memory, and Memory, they're really interesting people. They do really, really good Arabic translations, like very, very well done translations. But anyway, let me read what a portion of this Memory article says, and this is a really important one. It says this: Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave an interview to Russian media outlet Zestia that was published on March 29th, 2024. In the interview, Lavrov covered several key topics that shape the basis of the current media agenda in Russia. Thus, speaking of the attack on the Crocus City Hall, he said that it is not possible to exclude Ukraine's involvement in the tragedy and that the West's striving to prevent Russia from considering this version seems to be suspicious. According to him, Russia barely cooperates with any other country or foreign service except Belarus in investigating the attack. Now, this is really interesting. I'm going to read the second paragraph to this, and then we'll stop it there because there's a lot to comment on, and it gives me the leeway to be able to produce for you some information really critical to something that we talked about much earlier, okay? And I covered this when this attack on the City Hall building happened, this concert hall, and I talked a lot about it, but I'll get into this a little bit more. Let me read the next paragraph. It says, Lavrov sees the attack of cooperation as a result of the general deterioration of Russia's relationships with the West. He explains the latter by the fact that the West does not know how to do diplomacy, which he's right, and speaks only the language of intimidations and threats. Nevertheless, diplomacy itself is alive as Russia has the global majority with whom it could build relations. And by the way, there's a lot to be saying about this because Russia's got its hand in a lot of countries and it's all over the place, including the Middle East, including areas that border the Red Sea, and of course, including Libya, okay? Let's not mention Turkey. Let's not mention Iran. Let's not mention Iraq. Let's not mention many of the other areas that they're heavily involved with, including Syria. So the very moment we, as the United States of America, choose to say we're not going to spend any amount of time trying to develop diplomatic relationships with Russia, it actually becomes our mistake. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'll talk about that for just a second because I'm going to go over all of these stories after I read them to you. And I'll talk about why they're so incredibly important, okay? The next story is entitled, Kremlin says Russia and NATO are now in direct confrontation. Okay, that's a very, very heavy statement. This story is coming out of Moscow, and it says this: Russia and NATO are now in direct confrontation, the Kremlin said, as the U.S.-led alliance marked its 75th anniversary on Thursday. NATO's successive waves of Eastern enlargement are a fixation of President Vladimir Putin, who went to war in Ukraine 2 years ago with the stated aim of preventing the alliance from coming closer to Russia's borders. Instead, the war has galvanized NATO, which has expanded again with the entry of Finland and Sweden. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone, because you can go back and you can read this article later, but that is enough of what I need to take off on. It's the launching pad for a much bigger issue, because just those few paragraphs give us a really good understanding of what is going on with respect to NATO, and we'll have a conversation about that in just a second. Okay, here's the other one, all right? And here's the title of this one: Ukraine War. UN body urges restraint after Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant hit. So this is a nuclear plant that is in Ukraine, okay? So let me read this to you. It says this. It says, a new drone attack on Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia power plant has raised the risk of a major nuclear accident, the UN atomic watchdog has warned. So Russia said Ukraine was behind the attack, which it said injured 3 people. Ukraine has denied involvement. The giant Russian-held nuclear plant with 6 reactors is on the front line of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has repeatedly warned against such attacks. IAEA head Rafael Grossi said Sunday's drone strike was reckless and a major escalation of the nuclear safety and security dangers facing the plant. The Zaporizhzhia plant in southern Ukraine is the largest in Europe. Russian forces seized it shortly after launching their February 2022 full-scale invasion and have occupied it ever since, alongside most of the Zaporizhzhia region. The facility stopped generating power in 2022, but needs a constant supply of electricity to cool one of its reactors, which is in a state of hot conservation, meaning it is not fully offline. By the way, that's a major, major serious issue that's right there. Let me read this last line. It says the IAEA, which has a team of experts at Zaporizhzhia, confirmed physical impact of drone attacks at the plant, including at one of the reactors. Okay, there's a lot of stories here. Let's go back and start from the beginning. And let's talk about why all of these stories are significant. And I put them in this order on purpose because it's really, really important. A lot of people are actually saying right now that Russia is dying a terrible death and that they are not successful in Ukraine, which is why we need to continue to build our alliance. We need to fund Ukraine. We need to give them more. Well, the first article that tells us that Russian military has almost completely reconstituted tells us directly the opposite. Look, I don't need to get into this because the biblical implications of this are obvious. We know that Russia will, according to Ezekiel 38, lead a conglomerate of nations with it. Actually, Gog, presumably the leader of Russia, in the region of Magog, will lead a series of nations or conglomerate of nations to come against Israel. We know that they're going to head south. We know that some of those nations are Turkey, Iran, and of course, many others. And this is not something that should be strange to us. So when we read an article that says that Russia has almost completely reconstituted its military force, it shouldn't surprise us, especially when the casualties right now in Russia don't even come close to comparing to the casualties that we're seeing in Ukraine. If Russia has 400,000 casualties, Ukraine, I guarantee you, has seen almost 2 million. And that's just the reality of it. But again, this shouldn't surprise us, right? And then when you get into this next article that I read, where the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, gives this interview to this Russian media outlet, what's really important to catch here is something that goes along the lines of what I shared in the video that I did when Russia was first attacked, or at least when this Kharkiv City Hall building was attacked. And that is this: Russia was going to use this as a launching point to change its internal policies on how they investigate things like this, and it will eventually lead to how they position themselves diplomatically with respect to other nations. And of course, we are seeing exactly that being the case. As a matter of fact, Sergei Lavrov is already talking about the failure of diplomacy in the West, specifically speaking about the United States of America, as well as Ukraine and many other what they would label as or call Western nations. Now, this is really, really important because, again, there has to be a bit of a breakdown between Russia and the West if Russia is going to be as rogue as they will purport to be later on. And of course, if they're going to be as rogue as they are when they come against Israel. So all of this begins to make sense. And geopolitically, this seems to just sort of fit in a very, very, very close-tied or close-knit picture. I mean, this shouldn't surprise anybody. And then when we get into this third article, where we start talking about Russia and NATO being in a direct confrontation. Listen, they've been in a direct confrontation for a very, very long time. I don't have to get into the history of NATO making a promise that they would not expand, especially when Russia put down its arms. And you remember the wall was taken down in Western Europe, and all the things that happened the way that they happened, and the Soviet Union kind of broke down. Those promises were completely thrown away. Okay, it's almost like they never dealt with Russia in good faith. And I'm not defending Russia here, but I'm saying there's a reason why Russia feels like they're being invaded right now, because their interests, specifically to the south, is very, very important for them to protect, which is why their relationship with Belarus was very critical, which is why their position in Georgia and Crimea was also very significant to them. And yes, a lot of people will say, well, Georgia shouldn't have been theirs, and Crimea certainly should have been theirs, should not have been theirs. But the reality of it is they're there. And that's what's going on. And this is really important because I did multiple videos on this. I talked about this several years ago. Putin actually went to NATO and told NATO to off itself or he would off them because of what he was beginning to witness them doing. And so when we talk about these two new NATO nations coming in, those were nations that were already in the works. Russia was paying attention to it. Vladimir Putin saw what was going on. He was very bothered by everything that was going on. And so he felt the need to speak up and to take a stand regarding those issues. Again, this should not be a surprise to anybody, but this is nonetheless very important. Now, this one is also really interesting. When we start getting into this demand for, that's actually made by the UN to show restraint regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, there's a couple things that have to be understood here. First of all, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was in possession of Ukraine prior to Russia going in and doing what they did. The funny thing about this plant is there's a lot of debate as into what actually took it offline originally. A lot of people carry the assumption for a very good reason that it was Ukraine that actually took that plant offline in a very dangerous way in sort of an effort to make Russia look like they were the ones that did that incorrectly. Now, who did it, Russia or Ukraine? I don't know. But the reality of it is now in Russia's possession, and it is becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. Now, the drone attack that took place was very likely something that was initiated by Ukraine and was something that was done by Ukraine in an attempt to destabilize that nuclear plant with the hopes that maybe Russian troops would retreat from that area and maybe give some kind of a tactical opportunity for Ukraine to regain that position. The reality of it is Ukraine's not going to regain that position, but what this is all about is a massive battle for propaganda. There's a propagandist battle going on here between Russia and Ukraine. And one of the things that I think needs to be discussed is it's not just really Russia and Ukraine. It's the United States of America. It's multiple nations in the Middle East. There's a lot of areas here that have to be looked at. Now, the one thing that I need to say, because it is relevant, is that we need to be keeping an eye on Russia for a lot of reasons, right? For example, you need to keep an eye on Russia in the southern peninsula, the southern Arabian Peninsula, right? You have to look and see what Russia is doing in Yemen. You have to look and see their position in the Persian Gulf, specifically south of Kuwait. You need to be looking at where they are going to be, especially when you look at the area north of Abu Dhabi in the Mediterranean and Oman. You want to look at that little curve that's there in the Persian Gulf there where Iran is, because remember, they're functioning. Tehran is working very, very closely. Tehran and Baghdad, for that matter, are working very, very closely with Russia. We also need to keep an eye on the Gulf of Aden, especially the region that is in North Somalia, right in that area. You need to keep an eye on areas like Eritrea and Djibouti. And I already talked about Yemen, but more importantly than anything, we have to keep an eye on the Sudan, especially knowing that there is a military base that is there, or actually I guess you would call it a military base. It is. Russia has a position there, and Russia has got their eyes set on, of course, we're talking about the Sinai region of Egypt, only to be able to move stuff all the way over to the northern border of Libya into the Mediterranean because of Russia's interest in Libya, being that they're involved in a civil war that's there, and they are going to be, I believe, on the winning side. And if that's the case, then just as Russia is in essence controlling Syria, they will be controlling Libya. And what that will end up doing is it will give them a massive advantage in the Mediterranean by default of the southern Mediterranean position that they have, whether it be north of Benghazi or north of Tripoli or that whole area in the Mediterranean. They'll have possession of all of that, and that's going to put a lot of people on notice, right? Whether it be, islands or areas that people look at as inconsequential, like Malta, for example, or Cyprus, which they're not inconsequential, by the way, for a lot of reasons. Greece has got a lot to worry about here. We know that Rome has a lot to worry about. There's a lot of stuff here that's happening that's just a lot up in the air. So when we talk about this massive, powerful force that Russia has to be in the last days, they're growing. It's becoming a bigger deal. And folks, keep all of those regions in mind. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention to what's happening over there. And keep consulting the scriptures, right? Because we get so much insight as into what to expect because it's all going down at the same time. It's very interesting stuff. Just an update on what's happening, you guys. All right, there it is. God bless you.